and Professor Mukesh Kapila, who will also cover some of the lessons that we have gained from other genocides that have occurred globally and experiences from them. And also shine a light on the legal perspective in terms of accountability. So thank you all to our panelists for joining us today. I think we will begin with Sally Keeble. Sally Keeble, I don't think would need an introduction in our community. She has been very vocal and has worked with, especially with the community in the UK. With helping us advocate, with guiding us with a lot of things that we were unaware of. So thank you again, Sally, for joining us. Sally Keeble was a former Labour MP for Northampton North from 97 to 2010. She is currently the prospective parliamentary candidate for the constituency. Sally was a minister in the Department of International Development and will be sharing her insights today deriving from that perspective. Sally was also a founding director of the Anglican Alliance, an international initiative for development relief advocacy, which she actually helped set up and found. So thank you, Sally, for joining us today. I don't know if your sound is working. I don't know whether you spoke and I missed it. No.
Sorry. No, that's fine.
Okay, thank you, Sally. And if you would maybe give us a bit of an introduction about the perspective that you'll be speaking from today and your previous work, and just introduce yourself.
Okay. Do you want me to say a few introductory remarks as well about advocacy and the UK and so on? Because I understand that people have got quite a lot of sort of skepticism about, and I have as well, about what the international community has and hasn't done. And I think it's really important to think through how that moves forward, and how in a very different phase of the conflict and the genocide, how it's possible to actually get some progress and to get more action from the international community. As you said, I was a minister in DFID. I'm not actually the parliamentary candidate any longer. I have actually given that role up so that I can concentrate on other things. And I set up the Anglican Alliance, which wasn't a conventional development agency. It sort of brought together work that was happening across the Anglican communions. So obviously a huge amount of that was in Africa, and it was all led by Anglicans locally. So it wasn't one of the traditional sort of top-down development agencies. It was very much locally owned, and it was a bringing together of people's experience and also looking at different ways of advocacy. So as well as setting it up, I also actually learned a huge amount during that process. Now, as you've said, and thank you very much for your kind introduction, Mela, my role has very much been about supporting the diaspora community in making the case for what you want to happen, and in particular to try to get the UK to improve its position in relieving the pressure on civilians in Tigray and ending the humanitarian crisis. And some of the remarks I made, I'm sure will read across to the EU situation. So, please, I'm sure that Miriam will pick up on some of those. And I would just add, I'm not from the party of government, so I speak from the UK, but I definitely do not speak for the UK government in any way, shape or form. Now, actually, since the, and this is some of the questions I've had, since the conflict erupted, Tigray has been mentioned in the UK Parliament in its records 581 times, which might sound like quite a lot given the amount of action that's followed. Now, only 4 of those have been proper debates. The first one is, people might remember, Helen Hayes in March 2021. The second one was about a debate on the report of the Select Committee, a special committee that looks at international development, in September 2021. Then the third was Jeremy Corbyn's in November 2021. And the fourth was a recent one by Rosie Duffield almost a year later on the 16th of November. And there's a couple of things which are particularly telling, which is that all of those have been opposition-led. So they have all been done by opposition parties. They have not been led by the government, and I think that says a lot about the government's position on Tigray and on what's happening in Ethiopia. And of course, you will notice that 3 of them have been led by women, and I think that's not a coincidence either, because the sexual violence has been such a prominent feature, and that in particular has raised the concerns of women parliamentarians. Now, almost all the rest of them, there have been a few debates in the Lords, and Lord Alton, who everybody will know, has been particularly active on that. But all the rest have been questions. And I think one of the things that's really interesting, and I won't go into it now because it's not time, but if you look at the answers to those, very often the answers are misleading. Sometimes you might say they're mildly inaccurate, or sometimes grossly inaccurate, depending on how generous you're being. And there's a real need to get past the words and to look for the action. And I'm sure that that is a real issue for a lot of people. I could read out some of the answers, but there's probably not time now. And it does rather lead one to think, well, why bother? Why not just ignore the international community? Why not? Why spend all this time trying to get the international community and the UK government and European institutions to respond? And there's actually some very, very simple reasons, I think, for continuing, and particularly now. One is that I think one of the difficulties which the international community had, and certainly the UK government had, was that governments tend to deal with other governments. And they had long-standing relations with the Ethiopian government, and were very challenged to get past that, actually. And so there were quite a lot of discussions over the past couple of years between the UK government and the Ethiopian government, and they were completely invisible, and they didn't, I have to say, produce results. I think the situation with the peace agreement has very dramatically changed, because there are very, very clear things that the Ethiopian government has to be held to account for. And it is a government, so it is like, it has to take prime responsibility. And given that the whole international community has said, oh, this is wonderful, this is a peace agreement, this represents a prospect of progress, then it is absolutely essential that we continue to press the international governments to make sure that they hold the Ethiopian government to account to fulfill the terms of the peace agreement. And the first one is to get the Eritreans out of Tigray as well, because that is it's not perhaps written into the face of the initial agreement, but it's certainly there as a subtext, and it is an absolute prerequisite if the rest of the peace deal, it seems, is to be delivered. So I think now is a time not to step back from pressing the international community. And I understand all the skepticism people might have of it, but I think it's a time to increase the pressure on them to make sure that the terms of the peace agreement are fulfilled, and that the Ethiopian government isn't allowed off the hook, and in particular that there's pressure to ensure that the Eritreans withdraw. The second thing is the funding of reconstruction, because it's very clear that, as everybody knows, the physical damage, the material damage, the damage to infrastructure is going to take a very long time to put back together again. The damage to the human capital is going to take even longer. For example, when I was at DFID, the particular one of the particular things I focused on was infant maternal mortality rates, and on how it was because at the time those were the flagging Millennium Development Goals, and the challenge was to find ways to make sure that those improved at the same rates as some of the others did, and they were grievously behind. And looking at the figures now that have come out of Tigray on what's happened to infant maternal mortality, that will a very long time to get those indicators moving in the right direction again. That's in addition, of course, to making sure not just that schools are rebuilt, but the children's education catches up, and also to make sure that there's a reskilling of those young people who fought so valiantly in the TDF. So that kind of partnership requires long-term and consistent advocacy over the period of time. And I point out that hopefully there'll be a new government in the UK before so very long. And that should hopefully turn around some of the catastrophic policies of cutting aid that we've seen in recent years. And the third really big reason is about the justice for women. In the UK, the UK government has claimed a kind of leadership role in the fight against conflict-related sexual violence, and I think if they claim it, they better do it. And I think there is particularly in the light of the recent PSVI conference, and there's a question on that, which perhaps if you're going to deal with that, I'll deal with it later on. But I think that it is extremely important, if they're talking about it, to make sure that it delivers, not just in theory, but in reality for the women on the ground. Because Tigray is, to my mind, the most egregious example of sexual violence being used as part of a genocidal program against the peoples. And if it's not possible to get justice for those women and to prosecute the perpetrators on all sides, but to prosecute the perpetrators, then it really does give a green light to people in the future to feel that they can indulge in that kind of activity with complete impunity. So it's important for the women in Tigray. It's important also for those other women in conflict zones around the world to ensure that justice is delivered. And that is one issue where I certainly want to make absolutely sure that the UK government is held absolutely to account. There are a lot of other issues, I think, which there are to discuss about what's happened and the role of the international community. There's a real one about the challenges around the No More campaign, which the Ethiopian government ran, which I think has been profoundly damaging in the terms of relations between people who should be allies and the people in Tigray and people in Africa generally. Fallout we see obviously from the Ukraine conflict as well. But I would just urge that despite all the difficulties, and I'll be interested to hear what people have to say about the position of the UK and other members of the international community. And I'll be very happy to discuss and answer questions and see how it's possible to move forward. But I do think it is really important that in the context of having a peace agreement, which has got to be seen through, in the context of the need for allies in reconstruction of Tigray, and also in the context of needing to make absolutely sure that there's justice for women who's been affected by the conflict-related sexual violence, that there's increased pressure put on the international community, and in particular, from my perspective, on the UK government as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally. Thank you. I think you touched on some of the things that I wanted to kind of touch base with you anyway. So thank you for doing that. And I think you mentioned something quite striking about the fact that the UK has a role in ensuring that the terms of the agreement are actually implemented and do actually do actually have an effect on the people on the ground, to be able to give them that relief and to be able to provide what is innately what they should not really not have had to compromise in the first place. And thank you for mentioning that, actually. And we have seen, again, like you said, over 500 different mentions of Tigray in the parliament. But from your perspective, I think you kind of mentioned on the gap, on the level of engagement that MPs have had, and the level of advocacy work done in the UK to make sure that MPs are actually informed about what's going on in Tigray. And I mean, you kind of touched on it, but there is clearly a gap between the level of engagement that they're having in terms of the reality of what's going on and being informed on it, and the level of or extent of action that's actually being taken in terms of the UK stance, and whether that's in terms of legislation, in terms of making sure that the mechanisms of implementation are actually followed up. So, from your perspective, what is the UK's role in ensuring that this peace agreement is actually implemented, and how can people hold the UK government to account with some of the process of implementation? What is the UK's role in this? Maybe try
Yeah.
to tackle that.
Yeah. Do you want me to deal with that now? You don't want to take Miriam first. Do you want me to deal with those issues now? I'm very happy to. Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
If Miriam's happy to wait.
It's a really key question. That there's been a lot of information provided. I think, and this isn't an excuse, but all parliamentarians, all policymakers, civil servants as well, are just inundated with information, and it's about making sure the information, there's connections, and it's acted on. And that requires, I think, two things. One is to make sure that people can't forget or ignore the information, and the person who made that connection the most strong to Rita Kase, who you heard from yesterday, didn't you? I think because she, when she came back to speak at the lobby, she was able to bring her personal witness, her personal testimony as a UK citizen, to make absolutely clear to them what had happened and how this couldn't be ignored. And whatever you like to say, that personal connection and the personal testimony and witness was hugely important. So it's not a coincidence there's been a communications blackout on Tigray, because that has blocked people from seeing firsthand what happens there. And it's why rightly people say there's got to be a lifting of the blackout, so the communications blockade, so that people can see what's actually happened there. And I suspect it'll be much worse than anything that we imagine. We need to see that and hear those voices. The second one is that you're absolutely right about the follow-up. I mean, I've got some of the statements here, which all sound perfectly good, perfectly proper, and which has spun all kinds of different ways. I mean, I did see on one of the questions, it was the UK's announced aid for 150,000 women affected by domestic violence was one of the things. Well, it's not actually. If you, it's actually UK announces humanitarian assistance for 150,000 women and children suffering drought and conflict in Ethiopia, which is a whole different ball game. So there's one of the things that's much needed is just persistence and just keeping going on and on and on to make sure that the government doesn't that there's no sort of fudging about the issue, and that what's promised is delivered. For example, at the PSVI conference, there was actually one person there, not from Tigray, but Filson Abdi was there, and she was raising the issue about Ethiopia and the conflict related sexual violence in that conference. But she was the only one, and she was only there because there'd been particular pressure put on to make sure that she was there. So and there was a failure of the government to actually carry through what it had agreed to in terms of making sure that Tigray was raised there. So it's a question about needing to come back. And then what's the role of the international community? Well, I think it's quite simple that if they welcome and endorse something, then they have to also be responsible for ensuring that the agreement holds and that it's carried out, because they certainly can't be providing funding for reconstruction if there's a risk that that funding gets to support the war effort. And they also have to ensure that if there's going to be an investigation, that there's access into Tigray, and that the investigators aren't reduced to just phoning people up and doing interviews on the phone. So it is, in that sense, it's not just the UK, but it's the other governments that have endorsed and supported the agreement have got an obligation to make sure it holds, even if they're not formally parties to the peace agreement. And they are, of course, signatories to a whole raft of international humanitarian laws, quite a lot of it drafted by the UK, and therefore also have got, in that sense, have actually got a legal obligation to make sure that those laws are observed. I hope that helps.
Yes, it does. Thank you, Sally. I know I piled on a lot of questions and directed a lot of questions at you, but we'll get back to you after Miriam. Thank you so much for your patience, Miriam. So, I mean, again, you don't need much of an introduction, but there's so much that you've accomplished. I feel like it'll be unfair not to give you a very extensive introduction. So Professor Dr. Miriam van Rijssen holds the Chair of Fair Data Science at the Leiden University Medical Center. She is also a professional of international relations, innovation and care at Tilburg University Facility of Humanities and Digital Sciences, Department of Cultural Studies from 2012 to 2021. She was a member of the Dutch Government Advisory Council on International Relations and the chair of the Committee on Development Cooperation. She chairs various research programs, amongst other advisory committees of the Scientific Centre of the Dutch Ministry of Justice. She's also an international coordinator of the Virus Outbreak of Data Network in Africa and Asia. She is a project leader of numerous programs funded by some of the institutions we'll be discussing today, such as the EU. And she's also the coordinator of the International Research Network of Globalization, Accessibility, Innovation and Care. And she's also a founding director of the European External Policy Advisors based in Brussels, and she was a founding board member of the Philips Foundation. So thank you so much, Miriam, for joining us and taking your time out today, and to be able to give us a lot of insight, just as Sally has. And we have, I mean, there's definitely going to be endless questions, but so you have extensive knowledge of the extent and level of oppression, focusing on Eritrea at the hands of the Eritrean regime. As witnessed by most of us, the Eritrean army has been accused of grievous crimes against humanity and war crimes, not only in Tigray, but they are also very fundamentally oppressing a lot of the Eritrean population within their own state. And I would just like to kind of touch base on you about what you think the role of the EU and the UK is in discarding the level of threat and that the Eritrean army and the Eritrean regime poses, not only to its own citizens, but also to the Tigrayan population. And how do you view its involvement in the war?
Well, thank you very much, Milad. It's really a great honor for me to be here and to see so many of you. 90 is just really impressive, and thank you again for having me. Maybe I should, I mean, you have already introduced me very in a very nice way, but maybe I should give a little bit of my background, like how did I come to follow this so closely. So I was a political advisor in the European Parliament initially, and that was really, I found it a really very great experience. There was so much you could do, and it was just really an interesting place to to engage with the European Union's role in the world. But one thing that I experienced very early on, or I felt very early on, was that whatever you could do really depended on the voice that people had. And it became also very clear to me that those maybe that needed a representation most were the least present. So that was something that really bothered me. And at that time, the European Union was getting more and more complicated in the sense that it became more professionalized, and it's a very complex structure with a lot of institutions, and you really need to have a lot of legal knowledge and network and know what is what and who is who. And so how do you even enter it? So it became sort of my passion to see and to work with ways in which those that did not have that possibility to put a lobbyist in Brussels or whatever, to create an entry somehow. So I did that for quite a long time in Brussels with various conflicts in Nepal and Papua New Guinea and Liberia, etc. And so that is also how Eritrea came on my radar, because I was asked by the Eritrean diaspora to do the same. And at that time, I knew quite a bit about Eritrea because I'd studied with many Eritrean friends. So it was something that had been on my radar from the 1980s onwards. But if I would go to my colleagues in Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch or whatever, with really absolutely great knowledge, it was just not on their radar. So the whole issue, that became very clear to me. It's all about knowledge. If something doesn't exist, it doesn't exist politically. And for Eritrea, the big problem was already for all of that time that there was a huge amount of misinformation, and that basically the situation that we face today in Tigray, that the internet is closed, it has never been open. So, but what I could also see through that experience was, as the diaspora was giving the presentations in the European Parliament, etc., we made a lot of headway in getting that issue on the agenda. And in 2009, which now seems a long time ago, but we had a conference that then was the beginning, a conference in Brussels on Eritrea with US and EU politicians, because the policies were so far apart. And that in itself was a problem. So we felt we need to discuss why the EU and the US are so far apart. And we discussed that there. And that coincided with the sanctions in the UN Security Council against Eritrea. And I'm mentioning it here because that really made a lot of impact. And it led to the Special Commission of Inquiry and the special rapporteurs. And in 2016, when Eritrea was, it was basically qualified as crimes against humanity, the situation in Eritrea, and in that sense moved to the UN Security Council. And then it became silent. So that is a question in itself. Why didn't anything happen after that? But soon after that in 2018, the situation changed very radically with the peace agreement between Eritrea and Ethiopia, Prime Minister Abiy, who got the Nobel Prize, and so on. You know all that, but I'm mentioning it here because that created a lot of difficulty when the war broke out to actually really present information on the war and the background of the war in Tigray, because peace is good, a Nobel Prize is good. So we started in the conflict in Tigray with really being on the back foot. And well, myself, I went in 2018 to the border. I was back again in 2019 and 2020 and so on. So it wasn't surprising me so much. But I think that generally in terms of the, let's say, the policymakers and the political actors, it was very unclear to many how this war in Tigray happened. So being at the back foot, and then immediately the situation in Tigray also being under that cover of silence, I think that groups did absolutely excellent things in trying to really keep on giving very good information. So I remember that there were the petitions by academics. These were European academics, but there were others in the United States. Also, very importantly, the solidarity on the sexual violence that was reported from African women, which was a great petition, and all the time consistently asking for people who would consistently engage with the situation. So the ask, maybe you remember it, at that time was really, we need special envoys. This is a complicated situation. We need special envoys who are particularly dedicated to that. So we had Alex Rondos, who did a fantastic job. We also then had Havisto from Finland, who was also, I don't know if you remember, I mean, when he went to Mekelle, he was just really emotionally involved, which was important because you need to, for politics, you also need to feel the situation. And then at this time, Annette Weber, who's a very strong technical envoy, which is also important. So, it is obviously not enough, and the European Union is a complicated situation in the sense that it's a very federated system, so it brings together all these member states. There might be differences between member states. For instance, Ireland played a very specific role. It went on the UN Security Council, but it was also threatened by expulsion from Addis Ababa. So there are all these costs and gains to weigh up. But what I do feel is that during all of this time, the political actors that we collectively put time in, they have been delivering at the right time. A similar thing is maybe for Kenya. There was a lot of collaboration to keep Kenyan actors involved, and so in the peace negotiations, at least that was an important thing. For the peace agreement itself, I think that many, and maybe there will be questions on that as well, have kind of been wondering, where is Europe in this peace agreement, and what do you think of the peace agreement? I think that the peace agreement, something like a peace process, is in any case inevitable. It's going to come one day or the other. And in a way, because there is no military solution, or I don't think that there is a military solution as such, that can ultimately define the situation on the ground in a way that delivers a security for the people in Tigray. That being the case, I think that peace process should start rather sooner than later. So I think it was good that it did, but it is a very complicated effort. It is something where you have 2, 3, 4 parties completely apart. And so the give and take and the measuring up of the political strength is something that always happens. And what happened in Pretoria and then in Nairobi, in my experience, but of course people may come with different experiences, but I think is a kind of a normal pathway through which you try to get the maximum security for a process that ends up with an acceptance of the rule of law. And the rule of law in any case means that genocidal-like situations should not be part of that situation. So at this moment, the delivery, building the confidence in the delivery of the humanitarian assistance, the medicine, the food, but also the lifting of the internet shutdown, allowing journalists in, etc., are very, very important steps in that confidence building. then the big elephant in that room remains the presence of Eritrea. And I mean, at a personal level, I would say that every time, every year, I thought that the situation couldn't get worse. And then I was wrong. It has always, I mean, I thought this is the bottom. It cannot be worse. And then it can be worse. So I have stopped thinking. I mean, I keep telling myself, don't say that because it can get worse. I think the big fear that I have and that I saw over the last 2 years, and that also explains some of my personal passion, is that the worst part of the Isaiah's regime, the indefinite national service, the misinformation, the threats of everybody in the country and outside the country, the genocidal violence and sexual violence, the torture, all of these things have now become an export product. And we see it perpetrating within the whole of the other system. I hear it all the time in relation to the Eritrean refugees, but obviously also affecting Ethiopia at large. And one of the biggest threats is this idea that is now floating of this tripartite defense alliance that would also include Somalia. So to me, it is just so critically important that that problem, Eritrea, is isolated, and that from that isolation, the reflection on the rebuilding of Tigray can restart. And that's a very difficult task. Because so far we haven't had a lot of progress on that. But a few things that I have seen is that I do think that the European Union does see it that way. And I also do believe that that sanctions, like the 2009 sanctions on Eritrea, is not enough, but it would definitely be a way forward to put that pressure. And there are other pressures, like, for instance, the involvement in human trafficking as an international crime perpetrated by Eritrea in Libya is a situation under investigation in the International Criminal Court. So there are other ways and means to contain at least the problem of Eritrea, and I think that is a very, very important condition on the basis of which that peace process could go further. I also think, and then I will stop, that it should be absolutely clear that there cannot be any disarmament of any kind unless and until that problem is solved. And I think that is what the peace agreement says. And I think that any other interpretation is against international law and wouldn't hold. So on that one, I think we should, I mean, if I can kind of say a collective we, there should be clarity of mind that the Pretoria Agreement cannot be inconsistent with international law. And that means that the protection of the Tigray, the population of Tigray, has to be secured. And that is the only measure on the basis of which any other parts of the agreement could go forward. So I can give more details, but let me leave it at this. I think I spoke longer than I intended. Thank you very much, Elad.
No, thank you. That was very in depth. That was great. Thank you so much, Miriam. I think this kind of question can be applicable to both yourself and Sally. But so you kind of just the last statement that you made. I just want to focus on that. You said the Pretoria Agreement cannot be inconsistent with any international law. And I think that's key because some of the agreement, what this agreement entails, is actually basic human rights. It's basic safety for the population, like you mentioned, and that cannot be something that's negotiable or is cannot. It has to be consistent with what's actually applicable to global citizens. And I think just coming back to some of the questions that we're seeing, I've received a question about the EU and what the EU, and we can again vice versa say this by using the UK as well. So the UK or the EU, are they willing to suspend budget support as long as the peace agreement is not fully and honestly implemented,
I think,
including the irreversible withdrawal of Eritrea?
can I answer those? Because there's a couple of points. One's about the international humanitarian law and the other's about the budget support. If I can deal with the first one first, I mean, Ethiopia isn't a party to the crucial agreements that are needed to get a simple enforcement of some of the humanitarian law. However, that's no excuse for action. And I think one of the big failings of the international community is not to take the steps to prosecute over the war crimes. They've moved very fast over Ukraine, and I think they should have moved equally fast over Tigray and Ethiopia. Now, I am, the current route there are a couple of routes, but one of the routes is through this the UN Human Rights Council investigation, which provides a very fast route through into prosecutions. And I think that one of the things I'm certainly very keen to do is to continue to press the UK government, who helped to establish this. I mean, there was supporters of it at the UN Human Rights Council, as was the EU, to make absolutely sure that investigation does not sort of disappear somehow in the peace agreement, that it is carried through, that the investigators do get access to Tigray, which they haven't had so far. They've had to do their investigations on the phone, and that they are allowed unfettered access, and that the work can carry through to prosecutions. And I think that is really important. On the issue of budget support, I mean, there's all kinds of the figures are very opaque, as they so often are. The UK government will say it doesn't provide budget support, which it doesn't do in the old sense of, the UK government used to fund part of a developing country budget and in return would have a whole lot of conditions attached. It was a sort of very kind of neo-colonial approach in some ways, in many ways, but it sent a chunk of money to the government that often couldn't be tracked. That doesn't happen. Ethiopia is the biggest bilateral partner of the UK. It has one of the biggest funding schemes. Most of that funding goes through NGOs. There's certainly a strong case for sanctions against Eritrea if it doesn't withdraw, and there are many levers which the UK government and other governments could use against Ethiopia through, World Bank, IMF. And through trade deals and agreements, and through withholding some of the financing that goes through some of their ministries for particular schemes. I think it would be very interesting to know what people think about other funding streams, because, for example, in the case of Zimbabwe, this issue came up a lot, and the then position that it wouldn't withdraw humanitarian funding because that was so crucial for the well-being of the people, so like World Food Programme, UNICEF, and similar. So I think there are a lot more levers the international community could use. I think it's absolutely essential that they get the prosecutions over war crimes, preferably with the speed with which they've dealt with Ukraine, but in any way they should get them. And I think that if you talk about funding of reconstruction of Tigray, I think that the international community has to find ways to fund that without putting it through a channel that can then be diverted to further support the war or internal security measures.
Thank you, Sally.
Shall I also say something on that, Milat? Maybe. Yeah, so the suspension of budget support is indeed, it's a very good question because it's a really very important point. What budget support means is basically it's a kind of a general envelope that is provided as support, in this case would be from the EU or from EU member states to the Ethiopian government. And that is reasonably fungible, which means that it can, it becomes part of the government budget. So therefore, you can spend it basically on this and on that, which is why, as Sally explains, it really can be seen as something that can directly support the war, the activities in the context of the war. So that one, I would say that it cannot be lifted until the peace agreement is completed, is fulfilled. In relation to Eritrea, the EU also doesn't give any budget support, has never given for very, very long time. So it only gives very targeted support to mostly humanitarian purposes. And most of the time that's not even spent, because everything in any case somehow ends up with the PFDJ, with HECDEF. So every new commission finds that that is the case, and then basically stops all the money going there. So I think that is a really important measure that the EU has, and but I think that the EU can, in addition to that, really do a lot more in terms of sanctions, and particularly sanctions on PFDJ and the generals on the Eritrean side, to really block off that part of the problem. I see that there are some other questions, but there are also questions to Sally in the chat, so I can answer mine, but Melat, you direct us.
There are a lot of questions. So there are people wondering, I think some of the stuff you've touched upon, so I won't put too much of a focus on them, basically on the Eritrean regime's role and how they've managed to kind of avoid accountability for so long. And I think there is a question here about the level of access that journalists have been given in Ethiopia to be able to deal with some of the victims of the sexual violence within the Tigray region. And we obviously, as Sally mentioned before, there was a conference in the UK on the Preventing Sexual Violence Initiative, which, like you mentioned, Sally, there was not much of a Tigrayan voice, Tigrayan representative as such. Even when it comes to the EU, how serious are they really taking the conflict-related sexual violence that has occurred in Tigray? And will some of the investigations, the investigations that lack access and data to be able to conduct their investigation so well, will they be able to be supported after this peace agreement? And I think that if you can both try to answer that question, I don't know, it might be a bit.
Could you just, are you saying, do the prosecution continue after the peace agreement? Because absolutely, I mean, yeah. It is, justice doesn't stop because there just happened to be a peace agreement between the military commanders. It is absolutely essential. If you look at what happened in Bosnia, it took a very long time to get the sexual violence that happened then, or any of the or prosecutions for other war crimes actually to be carried through. So it is likely to take time, but absolutely that has to continue regardless of any peace process. And I can't stress how important it is that everyone who's got any access to any government which has voted for that UN Human Rights Council inquiry, and that continuing, makes absolutely sure that continues. And saying that, all due respect, saying this is African solutions for African problems, well, crimes against humanity are the responsibility of the whole of humanity, and there is an obligation to deal with them, because if the horrendous crimes committed against women in Tigray, if those aren't prosecuted, then what hope does any other woman anywhere in the world have who happens to live in a conflict zone and is subjected to the same? In the case of Tigray, I mean, and I think you have to accept that there will have been crimes committed on all sides. But what's been very clear is that the violence against a Tigrayan woman has been extreme, and also it is likely to have been genocidal. Well, I believe it has been, and I think it has to be looked at in that context. So it absolutely must be dealt with without any shadow of a doubt whatsoever. And there was another question, and now I've forgotten it. But that was the main one.
Yes. Yes, Miriam, I think you're about to
Yes. Yeah. So I think that the atrocities that have been committed into Tigray are really the worst, among the worst of atrocity crimes that we have, and which are part of the Rome Statute crimes. So the complication here is that these are legal things, like how can you bring a situation to the International Criminal Court? But the mandate of the International Criminal Court is to protect against Rome Statute crimes, and that includes also the acknowledgement of victims of potential Rome Statute crimes. So I think that there is an important possibility to really work with maybe the Trust Fund of Victims, one of the pillars under the ICC, to investigate the need to include it as an investigation, as a situation for investigation under the Rome statutes. That, I think, is one important element in Ukraine. A lot of work is done on that now, and it really does give recognition of what has happened, does give recognition to the victims, and I think that is important for any preparation of justice in the future, and also for recognition of what actually has transpired. I think there was a very interesting question also. There are lots of interesting questions. One was, shouldn't we speak about the major powers? I think what was very important in the UN, I think it was the General Assembly, or maybe it was the UN Security Council, but when the African Union started to say in the preparation of the negotiations in Pretoria to China and Russia, who are you to vote against a resolution from our continent? And I think that is really very important. And in that sense, the EU has been right, as much as it has been difficult to get the EU to stand up and do its thing in this conflict. But if it does, it is the correct communication that really can get a breakthrough at that level. And I do agree with Sally that the atrocities committed against women are really very, very important to keep on discussing, because I think that is something that internationally there is agreement about, that this is completely outside any norm from whatever political interests you come and you approach it. Except perhaps for Isaias, there was a question there also, like, what can we expect from him? I think that, I have come to the conclusion that Isaias is extremely intelligent. I also think that he is sociopathic, in the sense that I don't think that there is any empathy. So everything is strategy. And that is difficult, because most of us work with concepts of empathy, concepts of connecting, concepts of a future for our children, whatever. I just don't think that is there. The way in which he has completely sold out on any Eritrean kid should make that very, very clear. So I don't think that, at a personal level, I don't think that there is a bottom to what can happen. But the best, at least, that can be achieved as a strategy is the containment. I think that the bigger problem there is that and Sally maybe is in a better position to answer that as a former as a politician and a former minister, is that there is just such a fear of the future. What will happen if Isaias is no longer? Can it still be worse if Isaias is not there? And I think that goes into the psychology that is, at least at a European level, very important. Europe is a federal structure. It's a structure of collaboration. What it always seeks is regional collaborative structures, such as, for instance, IGAD. That is what it will support. The thing that and then a devolution that goes to member states, and from member states, then you have very autonomous regions like in Germany or in Belgium, where I live, who are basically functioning like mini states. So there are a lot of tools that could be very useful in the context of the future of Tigray and et cetera, But the European Union really has an aversion against changing that balance of power in a collaborative way. And I think that has informed a lot of the European Union's prudence in not wanting to lose the federal structure of Ethiopia. I'm not giving here my personal opinion. I'm just observing that I think that is where the European Union also comes from, as much as it also, I think, really has serious concern that what has transpired in Tigray is much beyond the rule of law and the international system that the EU promotes. So it's always somehow trying to find a way between those two observations. Thank you.
Could I pick up on a couple of those points?
Yeah, sure.
First, just to deal with the point about the journalists, which I think you put the question, Mela. I think it's very important that journalists are allowed access to do the reporting. That's freedom, that's freedom of speech, freedom of movement, all the rest of it. When it comes to the women who've been affected by conflict-related sexual violence, what they need isn't journalists. What they need is lawyers and medical treatment and support. And I think it's really important that we don't require them to come out and tell their stories and re-traumatize themselves. I think we have an obligation to make sure that they get access to justice, and that's one of the things which we've had some talks about, in the UK, and saying, that it shouldn't be down to individuals like Rita and Rowena to go over there and to record the stories. That should be taken up, or their work should be properly supported as part of access to justice for the women affected. And I think that's really important in terms of dealing ethically and fairly with those women, and not just putting more hurdles for them to jump through before they can get access to justice. When it comes to the EU, I had quite a lot of dealings with the EU when I was a minister, and Miriam's exactly right that the EU is quite a complex structure, and it also has differences among its member states, and obviously it's constrained then when it comes to the expression of its external policies. I think some of the member states have been quite outspoken, or have been speaking up quite clearly, setting out their views on Tigray and on what's happened in Ethiopia. In particular, I think everybody recognises what Ireland's been speaking in the way they've spoken out, but it's going to be a much bigger task then to get the EU to follow through on all of those commitments. I think there are areas where I think if people put their views, it'll be really helpful to see how best to carry them forward, in particular about the humanitarian access and the funding, the reconstruction, about the monitoring of the the peace agreement and the progress on that, and about the getting justice for the women. And by the way, justice doesn't just mean prosecuting the frontline soldiers, it means following the line of command. And that can end up with senior military figures, it can lead into government as well. But that has to follow its course to make sure that that there's proper accountability for the women and for all the other war crimes that have been committed as well.
Thank you so much, Sally and Miriam. Really appreciate that. I think so. I think a really important element of what you just spoke of was the re-traumatization of victims, especially sexual violence victims. And I think that because of the lack of access and the lack of empirical evidence that this genocide has due to the communication blockade, there was a big push to ensure that these victims are speaking maybe on to journalists and things like that, but we have to ensure that we follow a code of ethics to ensure that they like you mentioned, that they are not re-traumatized, that they do receive the right type of support and the right type of treatment, psychosocial kind of support, that the global leaders like the UK should be involved in leading these kind of support systems. And I do really think that that is a great element of ensuring that justice is also served, to ensure that these victims do receive the support that they are required to receive. Thank you so much, both of you, for your great insights, and I think you've covered such an array of areas that I think we could be here all day speaking on some of the questions that are being raised in the chat, some of the questions that I'm receiving, and some of the questions from myself as well. So thank you so much for being here with us today, and thank you so much for shedding so much light on such very large, kind of really hard to dissect kind of topics. So thank you, Sally, and thank you, Miriam. Thank you for your time, and we do hope that you join us further online, and we can probably share more in depth, share from your expertise. Thank you both, and I hope you have a great day, and I hope you continue to stay with us for Mukesh's and Gabrahiwat's section. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you both. So that was our section with Miriam and with Sally. Thank you both again, and I think we've all learned so much. It was a very in-depth discussion, and I think they managed to kind of cover the perspectives from the UK and the EU as institutions and as people who had vast knowledge of working within these institutions and do continue to work within them and interact with them, and are great advocates within the institutions that they carry great expertise on. We will now move on to the thematic topic of genocide lessons and experiences from other countries and accountability and the legal perspective. So here, I just want to make sure that Gabrahiwat Haddish and Professor Mukesh Kapila is with us today, just to make sure they are here. I think they are. If you could just unmute and give us a hello to ensure that you're here. Yes,
yeah.
I can see you.
Yes. Yeah.
Great to see you both. Thank you both for joining us. And again, like I explained, they will be covering a different thematic topic, and feel free, please, to continue to engage with the panel and throw your questions out in the chat for us, and we will be very happy to tackle as many of them as we can. Well, the panelists will be happy, and I'll be happy to convey them to the panelists. So I will start off by introducing both Gabrahiwat Haddish and Professor Kapila, and then we can go to some of the questions that we have for them, and they can do their introductions as well. So Gabrahiwat Haddish is a former Dean of Meghalaya University. He's also a PhD researcher at KU Leuven, Belgium. He'll be speaking on factors relating navigating to accountability and will be giving us a legal perspective. And I know he has vast knowledge in the legal sector. So thank you so much, Gabrahiwat, for being with us today. And Professor Mukesh Kapila, I'm sure you all know, Dr. Kapila has extensive experience in global and public health, international development, humanitarian affairs, conflict and security issues, human rights, diplomacy, and social interpretership with substantive leadership roles in government, United Nations systems, and multilateral agencies, International Red Cross and Red Crescent, civil societies, and academia. There's a lot to get out there, that's why. He's also an author and public and media speaker. He has been the Professor of Global Health and Humanitarian Affairs at the University of Manchester, the UK, and he has founded and chaired the Manchester Global Foundation, and he has also been advisor to Parliamentary Assembly for the Mediterranean, the Principal Forum for the 29 national parliamentarians of EU Mediterranean region, deliberating on the creation of best political, socio-economic and cultural environment for fellow citizens of member states. Thank you both for being with us today. Gabrahiwat, maybe I'll give you a chance to introduce yourself, to kind of give us some of an insight to what your expertise are, where you are going to be basing today's discussion from, where that will be deriving from your perspectives. Thank you so much, Gabriel. So I'll give the mic to you.
Thank you, Melat, for the generous introduction, and also thank you, the organizers, for the opportunity of speaking in this special event, as we remember the atrocities being committed in Tigray for the last 2 years, which is still ongoing. I think Saleh and Miriam have also addressed part of my discussion. I will try to not repeat what they said. Means I will rearrange my discussion a bit and focus on the international mechanism, and mainly about what triggers international mechanism and what portions of cases have been are being handled by the International Court and the ad hoc tribunals established in Rwanda and for the former Yugoslavia. And so basically, I'll talk about the legal accountability from international law perspective. And I hope Mukesh will give an account of the facts which has happened over the last 2 years, which is still ongoing. So without further ado, I will directly go to the international mechanism. So do you hear me? Or?
Yes, your sound is great.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So basically, from international law perspective, there is a duty to prosecute international crime, which is war crime, crime against humanity, and genocide. Yes, and primarily this obligation to prosecute is imposed on the state. So state have the primary responsibility to prosecute war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. But the situation of like war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide is a situation where people are traumatized and the justice system collapses, and there is overwhelmingly there is a mistrust and the propagation of mistrust, I would say, and people don't trust the justice system anymore, and there's a problem of like victim security in general. So these are the situations, and like it's not like when we say international crime, it's not like the ordinary cases where a functioning state would properly handle and give like come up with outcome which could be like positive or negative for the victim at the case maybe. But with regard to this international crime, we were thinking of wholesale destruction of society, their property, their heritage, and those things. So it's a very different context. So in most cases, even if international law places the obligation to prosecute primarily on the state, then most of those cases, like war crimes and crimes against and genocide, end up being prosecuted either at the international court level, of course, a small, very small portion, or through a UN-backed ad hoc system. It could be locally or through international cooperation. And having said that, so what are the triggering system? Like what does specifically trigger international mechanism? Because and so many atrocities happening in different parts of the world, but not all cases go and attract at least international response in many ways. So taking the cases of Rwanda, Cambodia, and the case of former Yugoslavia, including in the Holocaust, I'm going to highlight some of the important pointers which like many experts consider were important to like leading to international or meriting international mechanism. So the first one is, for example, is the Holocaust. There have been atrocities in the world even before the Holocaust, but the Holocaust was the first situation that have attracted international mechanism, mainly because of the interest of the Allied power, Russia and France, UK, and the US. So even if Germany, by and large, had a functioning judicial system, but Germany at that time was divided into two blocks, West and East, and there was like those international actors who had different interests and a different prosecution team. Like the French, for example, wanted to prosecute the Nazi and those involved in the Holocaust for crimes of genocide for the first time, but it has not been accepted. And the US, for example, wanted to prosecute for breach of peace and crimes against humanity, and of course also Russia. So this was the one of the reasons that forced that created an avenue of international mechanism for the crimes committed during the Holocaust. But genocide has been there. There have been discussions. There have been scholarly debates about, prosecuting military generals and high-ranking officers during the Holocaust. But it was not successful because the lawyers think it was really difficult. It was early time, that's the very early time to the concept of genocide itself. And lawyers and prosecutors were not sure that they will be successful in prosecuting and those perpetrators with genocide. So they preferred a less rigorous term, which is crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity by then, of course, even now, includes extermination and deportation, forced deportation, and extrajudicial killing and starvation. Those aspects are still elements of crimes against humanity. I understand for most Tigrayans in Tigrayan Association in Europe, in the US, in Canada, and Australia, we're overly focusing on genocide because of the magnitude and extent of the atrocities committed in Tigray. But we should also be careful that we are not taking war crime and crimes against humanity very lightly, because there's a very delicate difference between crimes against humanity, for example, and genocide. Both are really serious, considered to be a very serious and heinous crimes. And for international lawyers and prosecutors, when they prosecute on crimes against others, by and large, they mean genocide. They just mean it genocide. But for litigation, that they find it really not easy. Actual, that's not the right term, but better than proving genocide, which is about proving the intent to destroy a group or a whole or part of section of society. So for most lawyers, they just preferred and the term crimes against. That's why for the Holocaust, it ended up with prosecuting all the most of the perpetrators with crimes against humanity, even if genocide has been there, has been discussed, and the French lawyers actually were and presented and argued for prosecution based on genocide. And then 50 years later, now we are about more than 50 years later from that Holocaust in the Nuremberg trial that had been set up after the Holocaust by the Allied power. Then the states were pushed and pulled into different directions, and they did not have even a consensus on what to do in the punishment of perpetrators for international crimes. So some wanted to really maintain domestic jurisdiction for punishing perpetrators of genocide, war crime, and crime against humanity, and some others wanted an international mechanism. So until the period until another further catastrophe like atrocities in the former Yugoslavia and in Rwanda, and there has been this discussion, everybody arguing in a different way, and there was no consensus on what to do for security, for holding perpetrators accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity. So the second one that I would address is in relation to Rwanda, what happened to accounting perpetrators of genocide in Rwanda. And here what we see is, first, there is a lack of functioning judicial system in Rwanda in post-1994. First, most of the judges, lawyers, and prosecutors were killed as part of the genocide. And the genocide itself has created a big trauma of us and them kind of situation, and there was no way to trust as a judicial system and with the capacity to deliver an impartial and judgment. So this was one of the conditions for Rwanda, and plus the Rwandan government requested for an international mechanism. So these are the main reasons why the international community responded by setting up an international criminal tribunal for Rwanda. As part of this, which I would say is very important, is the role of the United Nations Commission of Experts, which was created by the former Secretary General for the UN. And this United Nations Commission of Experts, it found that the scale of crimes committed would pose daunting problems of the Rwandan judicial system, and that the environment for domestic trials would be too raw to permit impartiality. So this has also been a very strong recommendation to the UN Security Council, which I would say is in a similar way, Tigrayans and friends of Tigrayans here and there should see the opportunity of the UN human rights experts for Ethiopia. That's also one of an important opportunity for us, to proceed into another step to perhaps establishing a similar structure of accountability like the case of Rwanda. And this United Nations Commission of Experts similarly it gave the same recommendation in the case of Yugoslavia. And that recommendation has also been taken really, has been considered really important for the UN Security Council, which finally set up these are the two international tribunals. And first for the ICTR, and the ICTR International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. So these are I would say the conditions which would trigger for international mechanisms. There is also another very strong mechanism, which is very good tool for holding perpetrators accountable for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And this mechanism, and of course, embedded in local mechanism, and we call it universal jurisdiction. And this universal jurisdiction is still being practiced by many Europeans, and Belgium, Germany, including UK, and they had cases of universal jurisdiction. For the universal jurisdiction, the practice is of course different for most Western Europe. For most Western Europe, they can assert jurisdiction even if there is no strong connection of the perpetrator with the domestic court. Like the Belgian court, for example, asserted jurisdiction for many Rwandan officers and military officers, and even others who have been hiding in different parts of Africa and elsewhere. And so that has also been important. And recently in August, German court and asserted jurisdiction based on universal jurisdiction and prosecuted members of former Iraq security, members of the former Iraq security forces, and which is the case against the Yadazi woman. And so we have, for the UK, it's a little bit different. For the UK, they want the presence of the perpetrator in the UK, but at least for others, like Belgium, Germany, France, and the Dutch, they can exercise jurisdiction also, even in the absence of the perpetrator in their territory. So this is also another avenue that we can exploit. I think in the interest of time, perhaps it's better to wind up here and then maybe respond to some of the questions that would come later.
Yes, I think that would be great. Thank you so much for explaining the history of some of these genocides and some of these war crimes and crimes against humanity that we are familiar with, but may not have understood the legal perspective. Thank you so much, Gabriel, and we will definitely come back to you with questions. I think just to tie in with some of the things that you said, I think the mention of war crimes and crimes against humanity and the very fine line between those and the term genocide, I think that's quite a very strong statement. And I think I've heard Mukesh Kapila speak of other times as well, and I think I've heard him say something to that extent as well. So just to come back to that statement and to kind of go to Mukesh to be able to kind of give us an insight about these declarations have already been given by an impartial body, which is the investigations currently that was carried out and published in September by the UN Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia. What legal duty do global leaders have to take such conclusions and act upon them? Because these war crimes and crimes against humanity that were declared by these impartial investigations are clearly an element of, they may not conclude to a genocide, but that's besides the point, because they are in themselves strong enough to carry a course of action. So Mukesh, thank you for joining us again. Maybe you'd like to start off with a brief introduction to yourself, your work, and then if you could maybe go into speaking about that question and those declarations, that'd be great.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I don't think I have to take much of your time introducing myself. You've already done that. and people can read about it. But simply to make just one biographical point, which is relevant here, and that is that for whatever reason, I seem to have found myself in a number of genocides, notably as the head of the UN in Sudan when Darfur took place, and before that as a British government official in Rwanda and in Srebrenica, and as a UN official. It's taken me to the aftermath of the genocide in Cambodia. Now, coming to the point in hand, really, to answer your question, but to do it elliptically, a couple of things I wanted to say first. That, we always make the mistake of looking at the present through the lens of the past. We can learn from the past, but the situation, every single case of mass atrocity and genocide that I have come across in some 20, 25 years of international work in this area is that every situation is unique, every situation is different, and all we can say from studying the past is that gives us pointers. So, for example, the mother, I don't want to use a bad phrase, mother of genocides, because that demeans all mothers in the world, the wrong phrase to use. Forgive me, but that kind of defining genocide called the Holocaust, where the word itself was invented as a consequence of the Holocaust, is not the way in which the current genocide in Tigray is being run. It's important to understand. The reason it's important is because the level of information, the level of standards of proof, the level of engagement that led to the prosecution of Nuremberg trials and all the rest of it, if people think that that is what they have to have before they can bring accountability in the current case, then we'll be, sitting here forever. Okay, it's extremely important that people do not set up standards that were achieved, for example, in, say, the Rwanda tribunals, when the Rwandan government or authorities in exile, like Kagame, came in and established the rule of law again, and then a tribunal could take place and justice could follow, etc., etc. So those circumstances are never likely to be replicated in the case of Tigray. So it's extremely important people don't have fantasy thinking or wishful thinking about these other cases and think, oh my God, just because they did it somewhere else, surely it'll happen here. It won't. So that's important, to somewhat harsh thing to say, perhaps. The second thing I would like to say is, which follows from that, is that this is a very modern genocide. In other words, it's a very modern genocide. This is taking place in our millennium, our century. Of course, we have had previous genocides in this millennium too. However, the point is that whereas in the past genocide, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have satellites, they didn't have all those other technologies, we have them now. And that means a number of things. One, it means that sometimes the proof is very difficult to get, because only a genocidal idiot of the highest order would be writing memos saying, oh, please kill everyone, I wish to commit genocide. But this is effectively what Hitler did. That's why we know what happened. But today's genocidal people, they don't do that kind of thing. They rely on other technologies, and proof is very difficult to get in that regard. On the other hand, the same technologies give us a much better pattern of what's going on, from which one can deduce in a reasonable way before a reasonable jury of people that it has a pattern of genocidal violence. Do you see what I'm trying to say? So it's extremely important that those who are talking about accountability and they're talking about justice, we don't keep on being imprisoned by ancient judicial institutions. And all the existing judicial institutions that we have now, right down to the International Criminal Court, which is not ancient at all, it's a very modern institution, we are struck with a particular mindset when it comes to either evidence or prosecution, or the nature of or the volume of evidence that is needed in order to prove this. And also, criminal law, international criminal law, is still stuck on this notion that you have to find an individual accountable. So in the case of the Nuremberg trials or the Rwanda trials or any of the trials in the Cambodia trials, for example, you had to prove somebody guilty, and that somebody had to be an individual. Now, to prove an individual guilty, you might be able to get one or two individuals at some lower level guilty, as has been the case in a number of prosecutions before the International Criminal Court. But that is not actually bringing justice or accountability to a situation. So even though we know the Prime Minister Abiy is the architect of all this, helped by the Ethiopian, Eritrean leadership, the issue of complicity and accountability goes far wider than that of the leadership. Important as that leadership is, and important as that accountability of the leadership is to be held. So, in other words, what I'm arguing for is, and particularly my study of past cases or my personal involvement in past cases, and now what is going on in Tigray, it makes me think is we have to actually evolve the judicial and legal system, in as much as we are saying, oh, well, just because the people in Ukraine have now started a prosecution so quickly, not even a year has gone by in the war in Ukraine, and already they're having prosecutors, and courts are being set up, and commissions might be created, and so on. That's the way forward. It may be or may not be. I don't know. We can maybe have a seminar on that on its own. But I want people to be able to think creatively and freshly on this. Now, my second point I wanted to make, which is a way to answer your questions. People have declared that crimes against humanity have taken place in Tigray. That's hardly a secret nowadays. And you'd have to be deaf, dumb, and blind not to see it, even with the limited information that has come out. Therefore, what's the obligation? Well, legally speaking, other than a moral obligation, there isn't. I mean, there are crimes against humanity and atrocities and violations of humanitarian law taking place every day in many, many countries around the world. And of course, morally, we have a duty to intervene because these are crimes against humanity, and a crime against humanity in one place is a crime against humanity everywhere, and therefore there is an obligation. But quite honestly, there is no obligation other than a moral obligation. There might be a legal obligation if you are the legal authority of that country, if you were the state or if you were some protective authority, but quite honestly, it isn't. However, if these crimes of special nature, like crimes against humanity, are declared as genocide, that's the only international statute in the world that I know of, but the lawyers can correct me, and I'm not a lawyer, that has an obligation to act. So when you have violations against of international humanitarian law, we can shed tears, we can rant and rave, but there is no obligation to intervene, except for those of the protective authorities who are in charge in a thing. Nobody's going to do that in Ethiopia or Eritrea, we can simply say. Well, the rest of us, we can be sorry, but we don't have an obligation to intervene in a legal sense. But when it comes to genocide, if you declare genocide, then a genocide convention says that the state that recognizes the genocide, or if an international authority declares genocide, which applies to all the states of the world, then there is an obligation to intervene. Okay, and this is one of the reasons why people speak around this topic, because once you declare genocide in Tigray, then who's going to intervene? So if I declare genocide in Tigray, if I happen to be the Prime Minister of the UK, then immediately I am under legal obligation to intervene. But what am I going to intervene with? Am I going to send forces there? Am I going to drop a bomb? Well, I'm not. I'm a nuclear bomb on Addis. Well, I'm not Russia. And so on and so forth. So my point here is this: that it is important that if this thing looks like genocide, smells like genocide, then it is declared as genocide. Because only then is there an obligation to intervene in any collective sense or in any individual normative sense. The second reason for declaring a genocide is because the nature of the peace that comes depends on whether or not we are having a post-genocidal peace, or we are just talking around the issue, and then we're talking about a peace that is coming after something we define as crimes against humanity. We say brutalities. We talk about many other language we can use to say how brutal the whole situation is. But yes, now we have to talk peace. In my experience, the nature of a post-genocidal peace is very different from a peace that comes after ordinary massacres and atrocities. And so if the situation in Tigray is a genocide, which but as you know, I'm totally convinced on that, if anyone would listen to me, then it completely changes the nature of the peace process. It completely changes the as I think Miriam said, or someone said, you can sign as many agreements you like in Pretoria or Nairobi or anywhere else you like, but ultimately, no peace agreement is valid until it complies with international law. So you can make any temporary arrangements and truces and cessation of hostilities with each other, but for a valid peace agreement, it has to comply with international law, and then it matters whether the peace that you're negotiating is what it is after, what type of war we're talking here about, if you like. That's why this is important. Also, I think we know enough studying the genocides from Rwanda, Cambodia, and the Holocaust, amongst others, and Darfur. We're still living through the implications now, so history is not fully written yet in the case of Darfur. That the nature of the recognition has an influence on the healing process that follows. So if, for example, you have a post-conflict process that is based on denial or brushing away what has happened under the carpet and calling it everything else under the sun, but not what it should be called, then the nature of the peace that follows is going to be a particular fragility, because people's hurts have not been properly acknowledged. That's why deciding what it is extremely important for the quality of the peace that follows. And quite honestly, a peace which is not going to be sustained is a peace that is, I'm not going to say it's not worth having. A ceasefire is always worth having because it saves lives and it brings an island of humanity, and it gives a respite, if you like. But it is not the same thing as a peace that is going to be sustained. And we see this time and time again in the post-massive genocidal type, even if you don't want to use the label, situations in other parts of the world, where we've known that some of the peace processes have taken decades. They have taken decades. Cambodia only now have some of the legal processes being concluded, and Cambodia is still not a country that has emerged out of its horrors to the point that we can say that it will never happen again. Germany, we can certainly say that it's very doubtful something like this will ever happen again, though there are plenty of fascists still living in Germany, but it's taken 70 years, 50, 60 years to get there. So the point I'm here trying to make is that this is not just an academic argument about is this genocide or is this a crime against humanity? Is this a mass atrocity, or is this a genocidal act, if you like? These are fundamental questions for the nature of the future of peace in the Horn of Africa, in Ethiopia, in Eritrea, and around. Because please remember, we know this from the case of Rwanda and the case of Sudan, that when a genocidal type acts take place in a neighborhood, they have extra infectious properties. So there are plenty of conflicts around the world, and there are plenty of terrible conflicts around the world. But what we've noticed is that in terms of conflicts which cross the border into what might call genocidal conflicts, the violence always, in fact, is like a virulent disease that you cannot control. It's like if you like, a kind of local pandemic. So you see the problems of Rwanda, it's infected the neighborhood. We're seeing the problems now in Eastern Congo that are going on. And we don't know where that chapter is going to end as far as the DRC is concerned, in a way. And you know all the problems of South Sudan that accompanied the breakdown of Sudan, which was partly, and Darfur got sucked into that. And that story is not in any way finished. And in the Horn of Africa, we are seeing, of course, Eritrea, which is going nowhere, and which has no interest in any peace at all. And in fact, as soon as there is any likelihood of peace, the Eritrean regime, which relies on the maintenance of instability to sustain itself, is actually going to be a spoiler in this, you see. So therefore, I think this is an important discussion for geopolitical, regional political, as well as for sociological and healing reasons, without which you cannot have peace. You can sign as many peace agreements as you like. In Sierra Leone, which had terrible atrocities, I was very heavily involved. There were 17 peace agreements signed, if you like. If I remember correctly, I might have my numbers wrong by 1 or 2. But the point was, I was very heavily involved in the peace process in Sierra Leone. There were 17 of them. In fact, what we used to do after time was cut and paste from the previous peace agreement and just update it a little bit in the hope of it getting somewhere. Now, my final point before I finish. How do genocides end? Let's assume you borrow my argument for the point of discussion that this is a genocide. Before I come to the conclusion. Who declares genocide? Now, here again, go back to what I was saying earlier on. If you go to the old system, which is what the British government is hiding under, it's up to the International Criminal Court to declare genocide. It's up to actually in the UN Charter and the Genocide Convention, it's the International Court of Justice that was given as a legal instrument for that, not the International Criminal Court. It didn't exist in those days. And that's why Gambia has taken Myanmar government to the International Court of Justice in relation to the Rohingya business. Now, but the threshold of bringing a case to these international courts, and you can, in that case, also include the African Union mechanisms or the African Court of Justice or the Court of Human Rights and whatever they call themselves, and you realize that the process for trying to get this up to the level at which you will get a hearing is so high, it's not going to happen that easily. Not if you are Tigray. It ain't. It might happen if you happen to be Ukraine. But even in Ukraine, it's not going to happen without creating an international special commission. Basically, a modern version of Nuremberg will have to be created for Ukraine. And how that's connected to the UN, I have no idea, because I'm sure China or Russia will veto that. So the European Union idea of doing something there are very interesting, and maybe it'll develop. Then we will wait and see. So, therefore, as I was arguing, some recent evidence I gave to the Canadian Parliament, each democracy has to take its own responsibility in its domestic jurisdiction for considering whether the situation in another country is genocide under the Genocide Convention, to which every country in the world has signed up. This is why some parliaments, like the Canadian and the French, have declared what happened many years ago in Armenia a genocide. And by the way, the Armenia undeclared genocide, which people don't recognize in many places, is still causing problems in that particular neighborhood. So the UK government hides behind the fact that, it's not our business, it should be decided by some other place, our courts don't have to do that. Now, this is an excuse behind which countries are hiding. Therefore, one part of the point about the advocacy is not to get Security Council alone, which nothing's going to be happening in the Security Council, and neither is the ICC going to intervene anytime soon, or the African Union, at the current way of the geopolitics. but to try and get more and more countries to take it in their domestic jurisdiction. And I think the point was already made earlier about universal jurisdiction. But it's fine to try some lowly soldier in a German court, or a Belgian a small commander in a Belgian court. Fine, worth doing if that's all you can do. But I very much hope the national jurisdiction can go better than that in the future. Therefore, I think we should get away from the idea that it is international courts like the ICJ or the International Criminal Court or regional courts are the only ones that can kind of overcome this conundrum that we are facing and work towards a more diverse way of declaring genocide. And it's a crime against people, and it should also be the people's verdict. That's why when parliaments like the UK Parliament have been considering and declaring, or many parliamentarians and commissions have been doing that, what's happening with the Uyghur in China is genocide. That matters because it's the people of the country of that parliament that are making that statement. In many ways, it's even more powerful than one elite court doing it. So that's one thing. Finally, to finish, on how do genocides end? I have a little bit of a depressing message. My study of genocides, personal and professional, is that no genocide has ever ended except through the use of force. Not a single genocide has ever ended or been reversed except through the application of force. Now, it may be that, but as I was saying earlier, just because something has happened in history doesn't mean to say we have to be imprisoned by that history. And maybe we'll break new grounds here. And I'm always optimistic, if you like to see. But, the good news is that no genocide has ever succeeded, because no people except a very small tribe once in some part of the Americas who got extinguished by what we might call a genocide in ancient history. There has been no case that a genocide has ever succeeded. Even Hitler did not succeed, and neither will this one succeed. Not every Tigrayan is going to be wiped out if you use that definition of genocide. Having said that, no genocide has ever ended either, except through the use of force. In the case of Rwanda, it took Kagame and his troops from Uganda to come and finish it. If you look at Cambodia, it took the Vietnamese to intervene to finish that. If you look at any other situation you care to name, it has always been an intervention by force from somewhere. In the case of the Holocaust, as you know, the whole world intervened in order to bring that Holocaust to an end. So I just leave that. This is not, don't come to the wrong conclusion that therefore I'm advocating for a continuation of fighting in Ethiopia. That is utterly not my point. I'm just giving you the sober facts that it would be a first in world history if the genocide in Tigray just ended peacefully and everyone went home without accountability, without justice, without acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and without any of the historic wrongs being corrected, and we just then brushed it under the carpet, and we all said, okay, let's move on, let's be brothers and sisters again, and let love, peace, and harmony reign. It's I'm afraid an extremely unlikely prospect until, as I say, unless a miracle happens and a new form of history is created. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor Kapila. I think these are very harsh realities that we're being faced with daily, and I think it's important that we know just on some of the things that you mentioned about the fact that we have to view this genocide on its very own merits, like you said, and independently sometimes of other genocides. Not to say that we cannot take lessons from historical genocides that have occurred. Maybe that might even carry the same elements of what's going on in Tigray, but particularly I think you are right in saying this is a modern day genocide, which does have the pros and cons, like you mentioned, I guess, because I mean the use of technology has been very rampant, and I mean some empirical evidence has appeared because of this modern technology, but also the lack of access to this technology has also been somehow a prohibition of us being able to gather empirical evidence. So I think there are many elements of the pros and cons of this actually being a modern day genocide, as you have it, explained it to be. If we go back to Gabriel, I think just to kind of come touch base with you on the matters of accountability again. I think you have published various research papers, which when we knew about this webinar, I had the pleasure of kind of looking into some of your research papers, and I think one of them were on the remedies for violations and the process of making claims before the court of law in the Ethiopian constitution, using the Ethiopian constitution. And the agreement that has just taken place in Pretoria places the justice and accountability mechanisms for the victims of genocide that has taken place in the region of Tigray. It kind of speaks on the transitional justice element predominant under the Ethiopian constitution. Based on your study and knowledge, do you feel like the Ethiopian courts and justice mechanism are equipped to deal with the delivery of justice when it comes to the ongoing genocide in Tigray? Gabriel, I think your camera is off and you are muted. But that question was directed at you.
Hello. Hey. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
There was some internet interruptions, and apologize for that.
No.
I missed actually the question. If you could repeat the question.
Okay, so I said, in looking into some of the research that you've done previously, I think you published a research paper based on the remedies for violation, the process of making claims before courts of the Ethiopian constitution, using the Ethiopian constitution, and there you said that there is little space or institutional proclivity in the enforcement of constitutional bill of rights of courts. So my question to you was, taking into consideration the recent peace agreement, do you, based on your study and your knowledge and some of the research that you've done previously, do you feel like the Ethiopian courts and justice mechanisms are equipped to deal with the delivery of justice when it comes to the victims of the ongoing genocide?
Yeah, thank you. I think the answer is certainly no, based on my research, and which I have been doing even before the war and the conflict. We have been, myself and other colleagues have been challenging even the judicial system, the impartiality of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, even the lack of enforcement mechanism of the Bill of Rights embedded in the Constitution. So then the war, the conflict came, and the conflict has created different hostile narratives toward this Tigrayans and Tigray in general. And all of us remember, and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, for example, like working as the PR for the Ethiopian government and sending letters to the UN not to establish independent commission to investigate atrocities committed in Tigray, and the lack of responsiveness on the part of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, as well as the failure of the judiciary to properly address like the mass detention and arrest of Tigrayans in Addis and in other parts of the country outside even the war zone. So given the context in Ethiopia, and even the lack of like enforcement of the constitution, which is also as a legal technicality there, and this has been one of the concerns that I and my colleagues had in the past. And one thing that we should also consider is and which is typical to the Ethiopian legal system, is there is the idea of what we call prosecutorial discretion, and the prosecutor can choose, according to the Ethiopian legal system, who to prosecute. Like some people can go unpunished. So there had been this impunity, and which started long time ago, and several military generals and high-ranking officers and have not been brought into justice, and because of the interruption of the Minister of Justice in the former system, and now because of the Attorney General, no one has been subjected or brought into justice. This is because of the prosecutorial discretion, and which is established in the law, which allows the Attorney General even to refuse to prosecute. So these are also some of the issues we had, and we don't feel that the Ethiopian judicial system is sufficiently equipped and impartial to prosecute war crimes and crimes against humanity, including genocide. That's why we have been advocating for an international mechanism. I agree with Mukesh. The international mechanism addresses only a few portion of crimes committed and anywhere and elsewhere. There's only few cases, for example, with regard to the Rwanda that I've been speaking earlier. There were only like about 90 cases, 93 or 94 cases have been indicted by the ICTR, and only like about 60 or more cases in the ICTY. So the large bunch of cases are still being handled by the domestic court, and we still have to pursue that avenue as well. But it's also important that some high-profile cases go and being tried in the international mechanism, which also have symbolic importance, one, and also have the possibility of deterring future perpetration of crime, and also it can lead into providing justice at the grassroots level in terms of establishing truth and reparation commissions at a domestic level. So these are the possibilities that I would consider.
Okay, thank you, Gabriela. I think something that Mukesh said earlier as well, which was the fact that genocides rarely do not end without the use of force. I think that was quite a big statement. And Mukesh, if you could just come in here and kind of explain to us, what are your views on the ability of this peace agreement to be able to actually end the genocide and what's going on currently in Tigray? Do you believe then, if historic have seen a certain pattern through the end of genocide being through the use of force, do you believe that this peace agreement therefore may not actually provide an end to the genocide?
Well, I would always like to wish and hope for peace, but I'm highly skeptical that this initialing of a cessation of hostilities agreement, which leaves out Eritrea for starters, and says hardly anything about the accountability process, other than leaving it to domestic jurisdictions. And the other thing learned from the universal history of genocides ever since the word is invented is that in every single case of genocidal justice for genocide, there's always been an international component to it. So in the case of Rwanda, there was, even though the 99% was settled through the Gacaca courts. So I'm deeply sorry to be a dampener, but I do not think that this peace process is going to bring peace. We haven't got a peace process yet. We got cessation of hostilities process, on which covers, it's like a Christmas tree with many things hanging on it, none of which has been properly supplied. So the short answer to your question is that I'm very pessimistic. And one observation struck me by, I don't know whether it was our Nigerian facilitator or the South African vice president. I can't remember, ex-Nigerian president, who said it, but what he said was something that deeply shocked me. And they said, these people in Ethiopia, they've been fighting each other since creation. And then he went on to give a lecture, and this was in a public meeting. And he an interview or something, he said, they've been fighting each other for 1,000 years, or maybe even longer. And so I was struck by that. And the reason I was struck by that was because he went on to say, and I wish I could find the interview and give you the reference, it's online somewhere, that the implication being that he was very skeptical about the peace. His objective was to save lives by getting cessation of hostilities. So when even the mediators are skeptical, at least this was, I think it was a former Nigerian president, and he's the one who was a special envoy who's been working on it longest for the African Union, was himself saying that his expectations are close to zero on this one, though obviously he's going to work very hard on it and has done the best he can. Then I think this is not going to happen. Meanwhile, I worry that the Ethiopian side, at least, and the Eritrean side are using this pause to regroup their defenses and forces and launch. And we've seen this in every other situation. I've never come across any situation in the world, not just a genocidal situation, but just war situation of an ordinary war with ordinary atrocities that has ever come to an end after one agreement. It requires multiple pieces of paper signed over multiple months and years to actually even cease hostilities. So the very long answer to your very short question is no, it's not going to work.
Okay, thank you for that very strong answer. I do appreciate the honesty there. So, in your experiences of working within environments that have these kind of very vast human rights violations, and in environments where crimes of genocide are very, prominent, does the length of time for the acknowledgement of genocide, does that affect the victim community in a manner that's very evident, and is that something that you have witnessed before, where the acknowledgement of genocide has a negative impact on the victim community, and also the trust building element of it and the transitional justice that follows afterwards?
The traumatizing effect of war is generally, I think, well known in all wars, okay? Now, when that traumatizing effect is particularly acute when it comes to the mass atrocities, which we may call genocide, then the impact is multiplied. So you can't say, oh, well, there were two atrocities, and the impact of two atrocities is twice as much as the impact of one atrocity, right? When you have a genocidal atrocity, it's a multiplicative effect, because it traumatizes the psyche of a society as a whole. Because after all, these are crimes against the whole existence of a society. What that means, therefore, is that the healing process, one, it's very prolonged, is generational. And people in Kosovo are still talking about what the Turks, what the Ottoman Empire did centuries ago there. And the echoes of that are still going on in terms of the problems that Kosovo and Serbia are having at the present time, in which the European Union is embroiled, and Russia is embroiled, right? And this is a tiny thing that most people don't even know where Kosovo is. So my point I'm here trying to make is that the healing process takes time, and the longer the acknowledgement is delayed, the deeper the hurt. And what we also know from parallel discussions on slavery, colonialism, and issues like that, that there is a, I'm a public health person, so I don't want to use inaccurate terminology, but there is a quasi-genetic effect, meaning traumas are passed down the generations, and that is not quasi-scientific, that is scientific, because the traumas enter the essence of people, and they're passed on in mythology, they're passed on in beliefs, they're passed on in values, down the line. So what that means is that and the longer it goes on, and the number of generations goes on, and the deeper it goes on, then the harder it gets to have a sustainable peace, which takes much, much longer. Final point, elaborating point on that, very important. Sexual violence, on which people have spoken about earlier, and we've also discussed in past meetings now and then. And people have said, and something that I've said in the past, but I will now even beginning to realize again and again, sexual violence has happened in many conflicts around the world, and has been happening in modern times and terrible places. I saw terrible things going on in Darfur when I was the head of the UN in Sudan, and I've written about that. But by any parameters of atrocity measurement, the extent, volume, brutality of the sexual violence in Tigray has exceeded comparable records. So in that sense, the defining feature, the signature of the Tigrayan genocide, as I've called it in the past, is sexual violence. Why that's important? Because while you could argue that destroying internet, shops, hospitals, schools is a collateral of war, it's happening in Ukraine. In Ukraine, they're destroying all the electricity now. People are freezing, and massive crimes against humanity are taking place. But hey, the country's at war. I mean, Russia and Ukraine are fighting. So don't be surprised if bombs fall. And when bombs fall, hospitals are destroyed, and everything is destroyed. Trains are destroyed. People's houses are destroyed. But sexual violence, rape, is never a collateral damage. It is always an act of commission, a deliberate act of commission, and the nature of the acts that have taken place in Tigray point to a command and control element rather than a lawlessness element. So my point about that is that the peace process, which depends on the healing process, and the healing process that depends on the peace process, has to give a special track to the sexual violence. So whatever else you might agree or disagree on, whatever else you may talk about reparations or not reparations, or who's going to pay the cost or not the cost, and people can argue about that for times to come, as they do now about climate change and who's going to pay for global warming in the last century and who's going to pay for colonialism, and these things will go on forever. But understand that without specific accountability and justice for just one of the category of crimes, sexual violence, there is not going to be any peace. So even if you have no accountability for all the other destruction that's done, if you don't include the management of sexual violence specifically in a targeted way as part of the peace process, you're not going to have peace. You may do all sorts of other things like rebuild all you like and say, okay, we'll reestablish the Mekele's hospital and this and that and all the rest of it. But this thing will have to be acknowledged, tackled with, and it's got to be central to any peace process. The issue of sexual violence on the industrial scale that we've seen in Tigray by acts of commission by the authorities.
Thank you, Mukesh. I think that I've definitely understood what you're trying to say in terms of sexual violence not being collateral damage as the Ethiopian government. I mean, we've seen a lot of the squirming and kind of maneuvering out of certain levels of accountability that has been done by the state in Ethiopia based on like restoring services, for example, like you mentioned, and all these, there has been technical explanations that have been given that, are, seem to kind of take the accountability factor away from this. Again, like you pointed out, sexual violence is an element, is not inevitable in war, and the systematic nature in which the sexual violence actually occurred in Tigray actually shows a deliberate and intention in which it was carried out. Therefore, that in itself carrying a lot of weight and explaining and kind of being evidence to the intent of the genocide. So thank you, Mukesh, for pointing that out. I think noted that is a very important point. And if we come back to Gabriel, I think there's a lot of questions for you guys, and I'm afraid I don't think you'll be able to answer them all, but we'll try to tackle as many as possible. So I have received a question for Gabriel. If you could maybe reflect on after the signing of the peace agreement, like you have both mentioned, there's a lot of skepticism on the side of the Tigrayan diaspora, Tigrayans globally, other international observers, impartial observers, about how will peace hold without accountability? How will this peace agreement actually provide accountability and justice for the victims of the ongoing genocide? And what about the elephant in the room, which is Eritrea and the Amhara forces? So coming back to that, holding on to that, Gabriel, do you think there has been a lack of strategic leadership from our leaders, from Tigray's leaders, in signing of this agreement? Do you think there's an element of maybe skepticism that is carried that is just, or do you feel like there is a lot of things to salvage from this agreement?
I think that's a very good question, and so very tough to address instantly. My take is when I look to the peace agreement, the details, and accountability and justice is one of the interests which seems to be compromised by the Tigrayan side. It's one of the area, the interests that we have, and being compromised. I mean, and the negotiating team from the Tigray side stood against the promises they made before the agreement, and the Tigrayan government, the Tigrayan forces have been once and again and calling for an international independent investigation into the atrocities committed in Tigray. And the parliament, and I cannot confirm, but has been said that the house in Tigray has declared genocide, and which is really a very serious action on the part of the government. And having said this, like it was against its own promise, its own words that they came through and they signed this agreement. And in relation to the peace agreement, there it's not only this area. Of course, there are other issues that I cannot talk here, like the DDR program has been dealt selectively and targeting only the Tigrayan forces, while the Fano and the Eritrean forces, the major security threat in Tigray has been almost exonerated, like has not been really mentioned there. And the DDR was specific to Tigray, not entirely to all forces in the country. That has also an issue with regard to the self-defense mechanism that Mukesh perhaps is perhaps thinking to have been talking about. And if I didn't make, if I'm not misquoting, then you may correct me. So these are also the case. But for me, it's not only about the lack of leadership from the Tigray side and the context and the situation which is happening there might have forced the negotiating team to accept whatever terms, I would say, presented by the negotiators and the Ethiopian side. And the other thing I would like to reiterate is in the movement, the diaspora movement is also one of the concerns that I have had in the past, which I would like to also air in this seminar, is like the diaspora organization. I mean, the association is the movement, the protest has not been really very smart and systematically organized in terms of really making meaningful and steps towards holding the perpetrators accountable for the crime they committed in Tigray. What I mean is it has always been a protest, and people go wherever they are, and then another time is a protest, and people disperse and then come. It has been this kind of situation. There has not been really serious big organizations who can really lead and take and justice issues and send letters to the UN and cooperate with the UN Independent and Commission and try to channel the atrocities, and including the violence the committed against women, like sexual violence. It has not been really properly and well taken, well organized, and I would say this is also the gap that we have, and perhaps it might have helped the government in Tigray and the negotiating team think there is an organization who is also a pressure for which would like force the government not really to disregard this issue of accountability and justice. What I would just like to say is there is a way we have reached now at a point where we have to reorganize ourselves. Okay, we might have to do protest, but we have to think to establishing or establishing new human rights organization, or re-strengthening maybe institution established anywhere to really take up this issue of accountability and justice, and work not only for now but for the years to come, and perhaps connect and reconnect even with civil societies in Tigray. I think that's one of the things we have to do in the future.
Thank you, Gabriel. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more in the sense that there is a lot more work to be done in terms of making sure that there is strength in organizations that are created on grassroots level in Tigray, but also outside in the diaspora. And there's a lot of work to be done to ensure that these two are connected so that we are able to push for recognition of what the genocide that is currently ongoing outside externally, but also using domestic mechanisms as well. So thank you so much. That was that was a difficult question, and you tackled it so gracefully. So thank you very much for that. Mukesh, I think I will. I think the very last question I want to pose to you: do you believe that the geopolitical consideration of the world powers such as the USA and the UK and others in the West may diffuse the designation of genocide in order to protect the state of Ethiopia?
Sorry, it went hazy, your voice. Can you repeat? Diffuse the genocide?
Yes, I can. Yeah, so the question was, do you believe that the geopolitical considerations by the world powers such as the USA, the UK, and other members of the international community may diffuse the designation of genocide in order to protect Ethiopia as a state?
Well, they're already doing that. In the sense that they don't want to even talk about genocide. So in that sense, basically, they're doing better than that or worse than that. There is about denial for the reasons that I spoke earlier on. Because unfortunately, if you say you got genocide, then you're supposed to act, and the tools for action are so limited in that context, and we're talking of a different world than was the case in case of Cambodia or whatever. So that's one thing. I think having said that, the geopolitics really boil down to China. I mean, for example, if China did not have its particular stance on world issues, which it does at the moment, I think the Western geopolitics would be very different. So quite a lot of the geopolitics we are seeing is not because countries in the West have given up on their values or somehow they're absorbed in other issues, but simply the stranglehold that China has on the world and its powerful position in relation to business and politicians in vulnerable countries, continents such as Africa. So you need a whole seminar on this subject in terms of actually examining the role of China in all this. I was going to add Russia to that list, but Russia doesn't quite come into that list because it's got its own other problems to contend with rather than, and it's a completely different style of regime than we have in China. So that, I would say, is where the geopolitics really lies. The other thing to really come down to is where are the Africans in all this? I mean, you got all these powerful African countries, more and more powerful. Even in football, then they're now powerful. They're winning matches in the World Cup, and good to see that. But the point here is that why should the rest of the world bust its guts on this one when Africans themselves are busy stabbing each other? When the standard of behavior in Africa from African leaders in Africa against fellow Africans is so awful, and the rate of progress of improvement in that awfulness is about 2 steps forward and 1.5 steps back. So we are making progress, but it's very, very slow. Now, in that case, when Africans are themselves their own worst guardians, it really, really is tough for outsiders who've got other problems to solve in their own continents as well. So I am all in favor of African leadership for African problems in this context, even if there are not African solutions for African problems evident.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more, the last statement, because African solutions to African problems has been completely, it has a different meaning for me now because I have seen the rather different side of it. So I think, and that's sometimes a term in which African leaders choose the to hide behind the protection of other leaders that are clearly complicit in human rights atrocities. So thank you so much, Mukesh, and thank you, Gabriel. I think this was such a great discussion. I really, really enjoyed you reflecting that you have some of the things that you have had the time and knowledge to reflect and share with us on. And thank you for our audience as well for joining us. We have had a great webinar the last 2 days. I think yesterday was amazing. Today we had a great panelists, and I hope the panelists do stay engaged. And I mean, I don't have to ask twice because I know Mukesh has been engaged. Like he said, somehow he found himself within the element of dealing with a lot of issues that are surrounded by genocide and talks of genocide. So unfortunately for him, that has been life work and investment that he's made into such issues as ours, and we greatly appreciate his insights and support in this. And Gabriel, thank you so much for taking your perspective on the matter, domestically especially and externally. Thank you both so much, and thank you for our audience for joining us in the last 2 days. We do hope we will be able to come back and present more webinars, more experts, and better insights in terms of other thematic areas as well. And we will continue to host these webinars. And thank you to the Tigray Diaspora Council of Europe for hosting and putting together such a great webinar that we have all learned from. So much appreciated. Thank you all, and we will leave you today at this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and don't give up.
We won't. Thank you, Kesh. Thank you both.
Bye.